Good day, human beings. Today I'm going to be reviewing the novel Beloved by Toni Morrison. Beloved has been on my list of books that sound interesting for a very long time, and after I finished Babbitt by Sinclair Lewis, I was able to go and pick up a copy of Beloved, and I just absolutely tore through it. It took me about a week and a half total to read, which is very, very fast for me. Now, it's not a particularly long book, but it is written in a speculative fiction form, so you have to read very closely to kind of absorb all of the fine details that are dripped onto the pages. If you did see my video review of Babbitt, you might be thinking, Jordan, you said you were going to be reviewing Lycurgus by Plutarch next. And I said that I would do that so that we could continue our discussion on conformity in American life. But seeing as President Joe Biden just signed into federal law that Juneteenth is a federal holiday, and I have this beautiful, haunting story of an escaped slave and former slave fresh in my head, I thought it would be the perfect time for us to take a look at Beloved. I added Beloved to my book list after hearing John Green talk about it on a podcast with his wife when they started a book club while the two of them were dating, pretending it was about the books, but more about how they could just get to know each other. Green only mentioned the book in passing, but I have immense respect for him as a writer and a content creator, so when he recommends books, which he does often, they generally make it onto my list. But why am I reading it now specifically? Well, a couple years ago, I read Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it made me feel a kind of pain and compassion and empathy for the situation of slavery in America in ways that I never had before. Of course, you know it's something terrible, but it's entirely different to be inside of a character and feel what they feel. And when it's written well, and honestly, there's nothing like it. That book quickly became my favorite novel just as soon as I finished it. But there's some controversy around that book today because it tells the story of American slavery, but is written by a white woman. And of course, it was published in 1852 by an abolitionist, Harriet Beecher Stowe, to kind of show what was actually wrong with slavery, why it needed to end. And of course, no black author would have been able to have even gotten published back then. Nevertheless, critics have said that a white woman doesn't exactly have the inside scoop on what it's like to be an African American. That was at the front of my mind, and so I knew Beloved was about slavery, and I knew that it was by Toni Morrison, who's a very respected African American writer, so I thought I'd try and round out my perspectives of slavery in the United States by reading this novel. And we'll make a mixer for the video while we're at it too. This one's going to celebrate my first and maybe only summer in North Carolina, so we'll take out our native cheer wine, mix it with a little bit of brandy and some ice. And don't worry, I'll be taking a sip every single time I say the word beloved. Trading books for booze, man. I said it before, I'll say it again. Nothing better. Now, Beloved is a Pulitzer Prize-winning novel by titan of literature, Toni Morrison. This is the most widely known and critically acclaimed of her novels, being that it is a Pulitzer Prize winner. But Song of Solomon, Sula, and The Bluest Eye also come to mind as titles you might have heard. This is the first Toni Morrison novel I've read, but those other three are on my list and have been because Green recommended them. And I'll definitely be getting to them because I loved this book so much. Morrison is from Ohio, which is also where the novel Beloved is set. But after getting her undergraduate at Howard and her master's at Cornell, she moved to New York City to become an editor at the publishing house Random House, which you might know from the little penguin logo on the spine of books that you've read. Morrison died in her 80s in New York, and it was a huge loss for the American literature community, but her works, her words, and her ideas live on through these novels. Now, I'm going to avoid giving away plot points of the book because I don't want to ruin it for you. I really would love for you to read Beloved. But I will use information that Toni Morrison uses in her foreword, since presumably she wanted you to read it before beginning the story. So I'm not really spoiling anything except for the foreword. Beloved is set in Cincinnati, Ohio, in the 1870s after the conclusion of the Civil War. It centers around a former slave named Seth, who actually escaped her Kentucky plantation 18 years prior to the beginning of this novel. The story is written from the point of view of a third-person omniscient narrator who uses flashbacks to reveal the motivations of the characters and also reveals to the reader things that are going on in characters' heads that they wish they could say, but they don't say out loud. And that's one thing that this book does really well, is using dramatic irony to make the readers feel like they're inside the minds of the characters and know what they're thinking and feeling, even when everybody around them has no idea the circumstances that they're going through. A lot of high-level authors try to use the third-person omniscient narrator to give this sense of closeness and remove psychic distance between the reader and the characters. And Morrison does it exceptionally well, maybe better than any other book I've read. And there's no two ways about it. Morrison did a beautiful job creating a complex and human protagonist in Seth, and you feel her emotional and physical trauma both while she is flashed back to her life on the plantation in Kentucky and the residual effects of that in her current life. And there's a sense of camaraderie and personal tie between the reader and Seth herself that award-winning authors could only hope to replicate. Now, Seth's story is inspired by, but not exactly based on, the true story of an ex-slave named Margaret Garner, who escaped slavery only to get arrested for killing her own child when her slave owner came back and hunted her down to bring her back to Kentucky. She rather kill the child than go back to the plantation and let the kid see that life. Garner killed her own child because she'd rather see it dead than forced to live as a slave. And Morrison was very compelled by this dynamic. And so she used prominent aspects of Garner's story to inspire her own character, Seth's story. The most vivid aspects of this novel are Seth's and her fellow ex-slave Paul D's experiences on the Kentucky plantation, Sweet Home. These flashbacks are at the very least painful to read, and at the worst, they're just completely abhorrent and disgusting and completely contrary to human nature. And she weaves them in bit by bit so that as you learn more about Seth, you learn more about why she is the way she is. And the same with Paul D. It's something that Morrison does very naturally and does very, very well. And I would suggest that you read this aforementioned foreword to the book, which Morrison uses to kind of explain her thought process when she started writing it. It's not long, but it does contain what I would say are critical details, where she kind of lets the reader in on what she's going to be writing about so that you know what to look for when you're reading. And while the plot points of this novel are top-tier literature on their own, and while the characters feel like they live and breathe, the thing that makes this a Pulitzer Prize-winning novel is Morrison's beautiful telling and commentary on what it meant to be a slave, and then what it meant to be a freed slave in the time of Reconstruction. I remember reading a statistic in a middle school social studies textbook that only 30% of slave owners beat their slaves. And as a middle school white kid, I found this statistic very comforting because I felt that even though my Scandinavian ancestors weren't here until long after the Civil War, it kind of was, it maybe was a way to temper it. This horrendous thing that was integral to the history and that I still benefit from, it made it feel not so bad. Of course, that, as I got older, that idea was shattered because that's not a comforting statistic. Not only is it horrendous that 30% of slaves did endure pretty regular beating, the issue with slavery isn't the abuse. It's the idea of a society that one human can own another human being and make them do things. People forget that that's the problem. They think about the horrible conditions that Black people lived in. You could be living in the best conditions without being beat and still not have any rights. And that's what's wrong with slavery. And the fact that that not beating slaves was a justification of slave owners at the time for why they should be allowed to keep them, saying, "Hey, look, I treat my slaves really well." That was the mainstream argument. Slavery's fine because I don't abuse my slaves. And if you hear a slave owner saying that, you can immediately see the flaw in the line of logic. Morrison uses this novel to eviscerate that slave owner's argument because she shows us different styles of slavery and, the pseudo-freedom that they got after the Civil War. But she shows a plantation where the slaves are not beaten. They're allowed to handle guns and catch their own food. But these people have no rights. They're not allowed to leave. They're not allowed to marry. They're not allowed to be a part of a community. And they have to work for somebody else and see none of the fruits of that labor. And then she shows us a terrible condition in Georgia where these slaves are chained up and kept in cages at night. And what you see is the conditions of their life are different, but the costs are the same. Morrison brings home what is the universal aspect of slavery. That is having no rights. Having no rights, regardless of how you're treated, is something that all Americans take issue with. It's the center of a lot of our political debate. And slavery may be gone now, but the effects of it are still rampant today. Morrison refers to the present situation around slavery in America as hidden but not completely, and deliberately buried but not forgotten. And I think that is very true. I think for a lot of people, 2 lifetimes isn't long enough. It's not far enough back. And they're seeing the effects of it today. I think one of the more compelling aspects of this story, besides the horror of slavery even without beating, is the way that Morrison crafts the relationship between a slave mother and a slave father and their children. Slave owners treated slaves like horses. They studded out the men and the women and forced them on each other. They'd walk into the cabin with a man and say, "You're sleeping with this woman." They did this when they were, short on cash, needed a little bit more money, needed another set of hands to work. They were going to sell that child away. And this child wasn't chosen to exist by the father or the mother. It was literally facilitated rape. And so you have 2 ways to go about this. Now, the father's back out in the fields. He has no interaction with this child. And a lot of times the mother doesn't either, because she works in the fields and there's just one slave woman who's in charge of taking care of all the babies and nursing all of them. And what this leaves you with is a child that you didn't choose to have, with a man that you don't know that well, and a child that you'll never get to raise. You have to choose as a slave mother, who's never going to get to raise your child, if you're going to let yourself love that child or if you're going to cut yourself off from it completely. Because to let yourself love it is a second form of torture. You're already stuck in this place with no rights, and maybe you're getting beaten. But you've been forced to have a child that you'll never ever see. And Morrison writes this so skillfully because she shows us an example of a woman who has to completely cut herself off from loving these children or else destroy herself. And then we have Seth, who would do anything out of love of her children. And we see that both of these have a terrible cost that you can't recover from. And if you choose to let yourself love that child, necessarily you have to do everything, anything that you can to prevent them from having to live this life that you lived. That means trying to escape, trying to get north, killing your child rather than letting them become a slave. And these decisions are all lose. But then imagine it from the perspective of a child who had to grow up without any relationship with their father, and oftentimes no relationship with their mother either, completely alone in the world. And then slavery ends. And finally you're free, and you don't know what it's like to be a father or mother. Oh, and by the way, you might get lynched, so you can't stay in any one place for too long. And you have a child and you get run out of town, and now your child grows up without the knowledge of a father or a mother or both. And this quickly becomes a cycle that is not chosen, but is made by the system of slavery that we created, where we were studying black people out like horses. Many people use the nuclear family, whether or not you agree with it or not, to blame African Americans for why they are impoverished in America. They're saying because they're not showing their children how to live, maybe they're absent, maybe they're working all the time, it's their fault for being impoverished. Whereas these stable white households with two parents in the suburbs are going splendidly. And I think we all need to remember that my grandfather's grandfather, 2 lifetimes ago, was alive when there was slavery in America and other parts of the world. And that generationally, you don't have to go far back to see why somebody might not have a strong relationship between father and son, or between mother and son, or between mother and daughter. It would be crazy for you to lay that on the African American community after creating that system yourself. You're talking about 2 lifetimes to undo a system that was imposed on this community for 150 years. And then with lynchings and Jim Crow, it was just as hard to have a nuclear family. So if that truly is the difference, who is there to blame except the system of government that allowed the dehumanization and studying of African American people? And how can you blame them for that system existing in the first place? I'll leave that for you to ponder. This book has heavy implications for every American, but it's also just an amazing story of the black person in America, and you should read it even if you just like ghost stories. Even if you don't want to go as deep and as heavy as Toni Morrison is willing to go, there's still just a beautiful plot and a beautiful ghost story right before your eyes. I give this book a 5 out of 5 on the Jordan scale, and I will be reading more books by Toni Morrison in the future. I do also make more lighthearted content on this channel. My last video, for example, was a walkthrough of a $5.5 million mansion on Zillow, and I tear apart and criticize it because I can't afford it. So go ahead, feel free to check that out. The link's in the description below. If you do want to buy a copy of Beloved, I have an Amazon link in the description below. Like this video if you enjoyed it. Please comment what you thought about this discussion. I'd love to engage with you. And subscribe to the channel. That would really be a big help. And until the next time, cheers.